The Book of Enoch had to be removed because
These things like the Book of Enoch or
No one could explain why it glowed red, while everything else in the sky did not.
Mars is a 4-billion-year-old mystery, and scientists have spent decades studying its fate. But here's the part that raises eyebrows. Buried inside a religious book is an unsettling story about a world that was different and beings that supposedly came from beyond Earth. So was Enoch telling a story, or did it preserve a memory of what happened on Mars? This is the story of the Book of Enoch and the world that may have existed on the Red Planet. The Mountain Archive and the book that disappeared. Many years ago, Mars looked nothing like the cold, dusty world we see today. Back then, the planet had a much thicker atmosphere, water flowing across its surface, and conditions that may have been able to support life. But somewhere along the way, something changed. The atmosphere slowly thinned out, the water disappeared from the surface, and Mars was left with some of the biggest scars in our solar system. Today, scientists are still trying to figure out exactly what happened to Mars. But this is where the story starts to take an interesting turn. Thousands of years before anyone had a spacecraft, an ancient book was already telling stories about heavenly beings, forbidden knowledge, judgment, and a world left desolate. This book was the Book of Enoch. For most people, the Book of Enoch is simply a mysterious and controversial book they have heard about online. But the story behind it goes much deeper than that. The text takes Enoch on strange journeys through the heavens, introduces beings called the Watchers who come down to Earth, and describes places far beyond the ordinary human world. It also tells what happens when these heavenly beings cross boundaries they were never supposed to cross. And that is where Enoch starts to sound very different from the Bible most of us grew up reading. Now, how did a book this controversial survive for thousands of years? And why did early church leaders fight so hard to push it aside? You see, as Christianity began spreading through the Roman world, church leaders were forced to ask themselves a major question. Which ancient writings should be kept, and which ones should be pushed aside? Leaders like Athanasius of Alexandria and Jerome were familiar with the Book of Enoch, but some of its stories made them deeply uncomfortable. The book described angels taking physical form, coming down to earth, and marrying human women. To many 4th century church thinkers, this idea simply did not fit with how they understood the spiritual world. They believed heavenly beings were not supposed to cross those physical boundaries, and they worried that accepting a book like the Book of Enoch could open the door to beliefs they considered dangerous. And as the centuries passed, fewer people in Western Europe continued reading the Book of Enoch, and before long, the book slowly disappeared from the Christian traditions that became dominant there. Eventually, many people assumed the complete text was gone for good. All that remained were a few quotations and small pieces in other ancient writings. So, for a long time, it seemed like the Book of Enoch had truly vanished. But then, more than 1,000 years later, the story took an unexpected turn. In 1773, Scottish explorer James Bruce traveled through Ethiopia and came across something European scholars had almost given up hope of finding. Surprisingly, Ethiopian Christians had continued preserving the Book of Enoch in the ancient Ge'ez language, copying it from one generation to the next, while much of Europe had forgotten about it. Bruce returned to Europe with 3 complete copies, and just like that, the book many people believed was lost was back in the hands of European scholars. But one question still lingered. How old was this book really? Was the Ethiopian version written much later, or was it preserving a story that had already been around for thousands of years? Well, in 1947, an extraordinary discovery near the Dead Sea gave scholars a way to find out. Ancient scrolls were discovered in caves near Qumran, close to the Dead Sea, and among the thousands of fragments were pieces of the Book of Enoch. These fragments were far older than the Ethiopian manuscripts scholars already knew about, which meant researchers finally had something much earlier to compare with the surviving Ethiopian text. And finally, they were able to confirm that the Book of Enoch really was an ancient book. Its unsettling stories had been circulating in the ancient world long before the manuscripts preserved in Ethiopia were produced. And that is what makes the Book of Enoch so interesting to us today. A book written in a world with no telescopes, satellites, or spacecraft somehow survived long enough for people living thousands of years later to read it again. The writers of Enoch could only look up at the sky and wonder what was happening beyond the world they knew. Today, we have a very different way of looking at the sky. We have spacecraft that can travel to Mars, photograph its surface, and study what is happening around the planet. NASA's MAVEN has helped scientists learn more about Mars and its past, while images from the planet have revealed features that have left researchers with plenty of questions. And this is where our story brings the ancient book back into the picture. Because once we look at what Enoch actually says about the heavens, some of those descriptions start to sound very unsettling when we know what Mars looks like today. The seven heavens and the strange map in Enoch. Now, when you go deeper into the Book of Enoch, you start to notice something unusual. The book isn't only concerned with people, faith, or how humans should behave. A surprising amount of it is spent describing the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars, and places Enoch claims he was shown. In some parts, it almost sounds like someone is showing him a strange map of the universe, explaining where everything is supposed to be and how everything is supposed to move. One of the most interesting sections is the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries, where Enoch is guided by an angel named Uriel. Now, Uriel doesn't simply tell him that heaven is beautiful or mysterious. Instead, he explains how the sun, moon, and stars move through what Enoch describes as gates or openings in the heavens. The sun appears at different points during the year. The moon follows its own pattern, and the stars are expected to stay on their assigned paths. To Enoch, these movements are not random. They are part of a system that has already been set in place, with each part of the heavens following its own path. Enoch also describes a calendar based on 364 days and spends a surprising amount of time explaining the changing position of the sun throughout the year. He describes where the sun rises and sets, and how its position changes as the seasons pass. Of course, this came from an ancient world with no telescopes, satellites, or modern astronomy. The people behind these traditions were trying to understand the sky with the knowledge they had, so their descriptions were shaped by the world they knew. Still, the amount of attention Enoch gives to these movements is striking, because it shows how important the order of the heavens was to the people who preserved these stories. However, the way Enoch organizes the universe is still fascinating. Everything seems to have a place. The sun has its path. The moon has its path. The stars have their rules. And heavenly beings have responsibilities they are expected to follow. Nothing is supposed to move outside the order that has been established. The heavens are presented almost like a carefully arranged system, where every part has a job and every being is expected to remain where it belongs. And this idea of order becomes important because, according to Enoch, not every heavenly being was willing to stay where it had been placed. Some began looking toward Earth and became interested in human life. What may have started as curiosity eventually became something much more serious. These beings were not supposed to leave their position or interfere with the human world, yet they decided to cross that boundary anyway. Eventually, they made a decision that would change the story completely. They would leave their assigned position, cross a boundary they were never supposed to cross, and come down into the human world. At first, it may have seemed like a simple act of rebellion, but Enoch's story shows that the consequences would spread far beyond the beings who made that choice. Their arrival on Earth would bring new knowledge, new relationships, violence, and eventually a disaster that would affect the entire human world. The Watchers and the world they left behind. The Watchers had obviously crossed the line, but according to the Book of Enoch, the real trouble was only beginning. The text says about 200 of these beings gathered at Mount Hermon under a leader named Shemihaza and made a serious agreement among themselves. They knew they were breaking the order they had been given, but they went ahead anyway, came down to Earth, and took human women as wives. Of course, their relationships with humans were only part of the problem. Enoch says the Watchers also began passing knowledge to people that they were never supposed to have. Azazel, for example, was blamed for teaching humans how to work with metals and make weapons, while other Watchers were associated with astrology, magic, and other forms of knowledge. In Enoch's story, this knowledge didn't just make humans smarter, it also brought more violence, more corruption, and a growing feeling that the old rules no longer mattered. Now, the children born from the relationships between the Watchers and human women were called giants, and Enoch described them as powerful, violent beings whose hunger eventually became impossible to satisfy. As their numbers increased, so did the destruction around them. They began turning on humans, and the world became increasingly violent and corrupt. At this point, the rebellion was no longer a private matter between the Watchers and heaven. The damage had spread across the earth, and according to Enoch, heaven finally responded. Angels, including Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, were sent to deal with the Watchers and the destruction connected to them. The giants were marked for destruction, while the Watchers were condemned, stripped of their freedom, and bound while they waited for judgment. But according to Enoch, the Watchers were not simply defeated and forgotten. They were removed from the place they had once belonged and sent away to a desolate place, separated from the order they had once been part of. Their punishment was tied to the very place they had abandoned. This part of the story is what later caught the attention of people looking at Enoch through a very different lens. If these heavenly beings had left one place and were later sent away to a barren and desolate region, could that place have been somewhere beyond Earth? Also, Mars gives us an interesting reason to make this comparison. Like we mentioned earlier, the Mars we see today is cold, dry, and covered in dust. But it was not always this way. Billions of years ago, Mars had rivers, lakes, and a much thicker atmosphere. It was a world that looked very different from the one we see today. So what happened to it? This question has kept scientists up at night for decades. Something changed, and whatever happened slowly turned a once wetter world into the cold planet we know now. And one of the biggest parts of this story involves something we cannot even see, a protective shield that once surrounded the planet. When this shield was gone, Mars was left exposed to the harsh conditions of space. And that may be one of the biggest clues to understanding how the planet went from the world it once was to the barren place we see today. The stripping of the protective shelter. Now, when Enoch is taken to see the final place of the rebellious beings, the story suddenly becomes very unsettling. Instead of showing him a world filled with order and movement, the text describes a place that has been left exposed and ruined. The land is harsh, the surroundings are empty, and the protection that once made the place secure seems to be gone. Everything feels abandoned, as though something once stood there but was deliberately left behind. Enoch is not shown a thriving world, but a desolate place marked by isolation and destruction, raising questions about what could have happened there. For centuries, scientists simply understood this as part of Enoch's story about judgment. But when you put those old descriptions next to what scientists have discovered about Mars, the comparison starts to feel surprisingly familiar. As we've mentioned, Mars was not always the cold, dusty world we see today. Billions of years ago, the planet appears to have had a much thicker atmosphere, with rivers and lakes spread across parts of its surface. Scientists also believe Mars once had a global magnetic field. And this field was extremely important because it helped shield the planet from the solar wind, a constant stream of charged particles coming from the sun. Think of it as an invisible protective layer around the planet, helping to keep its atmosphere from being slowly carried away. But Mars eventually lost that protection. As the planet cooled, the movement inside its core weakened, and its global magnetic field disappeared. Without that shield, the solar wind could interact much more directly with the upper atmosphere and gradually carry atmospheric particles away into space. Over a very long period of time, Mars lost much of the thick atmosphere it once had, making it harder for the planet to stay warm and for liquid water to remain on its surface. This change completely reshaped the planet. Water that once flowed across the surface eventually disappeared, with much of what remains now frozen beneath the ground or trapped in other forms. The atmosphere became extremely thin, temperatures dropped, and the world that may once have been much wetter became the cold, dry landscape we see today. And when you look at Mars now, it almost feels like you are looking at the remains of a world that has been sitting there for billions of years, waiting for someone to figure out what happened to it. This is also why the old description in Enoch catches people's attention. The book tells a story about a place that loses its protection and is left exposed, while modern science tells us about a planet that lost much of its own protection and went through a massive environmental change. The reasons are completely different, but the picture they leave behind is surprisingly similar. Protection disappears, the environment changes, and a once very different world is left cold and barren. And Mars has another clue that makes its past even harder to ignore. Across the planet's surface is a gigantic system of canyons so enormous that it makes Earth's Grand Canyon look tiny by comparison. It stretches for thousands of kilometers and cuts deep into the Martian crust. Scientists call it Valles Marineris, and understanding how that large scar formed takes our story from a planet that simply lost its atmosphere to a world that appears to have been violently reshaped from the inside. So if Mars really was once a much wetter and more protected world, what happened to its surface when that old world began to break apart? And what can this scar tell us about the planet Mars used to be? The Great Tearing and the Anomalies. If Mars really is the kind of ruined world people see when they read the Book of Enoch, then the planet itself should have some signs of what happened to it. And Mars certainly has no shortage of strange marks. One of the biggest is Valles Marineris, a huge system of valleys that cuts across the planet for more than 4,000 kilometers. In some places, it reaches several kilometers deep, making it far longer than the Grand Canyon. Scientists believe it formed as the Martian crust stretched and cracked, with huge changes in the nearby Tharsis region helping shape the valleys we see today. What makes this interesting for the Enoch story is the way the ancient text describes places that were damaged and left in ruin. Enoch was not writing about Mars as we understand it today. But when modern readers look at those old descriptions and then see a planet covered with massive cracks, scars, and barren landscapes, it is easy to see why the comparison keeps coming back. The similarities may be purely coincidental, but they create an intriguing question. Could ancient descriptions of destruction remind us of what Mars looks like today? Then there is Cydonia, the part of Mars that really made people start asking questions. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 spacecraft photographed a strange mesa on the Martian surface. From that angle, with the sunlight falling across it in just the right way, the formation looked remarkably like a giant human face. Nearby were other formations that some people thought looked like pyramids, and almost immediately, the image became part of a much bigger story about possible life on Mars. For years, some people believed the face might be the remains of something built by an ancient civilization. The idea was exciting because it seemed to turn Mars from a dead planet into the possible home of something that had once been alive. But when NASA later photographed the same area with much better cameras, the famous face looked very different. With clearer images and better lighting, it became obvious that the formation was a natural rock shaped by the planet's own geology. Still, Cydonia became part of the Mars mystery for another reason. It showed just how quickly an unusual feature could make people wonder whether Mars had a story we had not yet uncovered. And if the surface already looked strange, what about the objects moving around the planet? The two moons that seem to move backward. You see, Mars has two small moons called Phobos and Deimos, and both are unusual. They are tiny, dark, and irregularly shaped, and they were not discovered until 1877, when American astronomer Asaph Hall spotted them while studying Mars.
In 1877, American astronomer Asaph Hall discovered Mars's moon Phobos. Upon further inspection, not only did he realize that the star was actually the Martian moon Deimos, but he also discovered a second larger moon now known as Phobos.
Their names are even older than the moons themselves. In Greek mythology, Phobos and Deimos were companions of Ares, the god of war. and their names are linked to fear and dread. Ares was later known to the Romans as Mars, which makes the name seem almost too fitting. But Phobos is the one that really catches your attention. It orbits extremely close to Mars, taking only about 7.5 hours to complete one trip around the planet. Mars takes about 24.5 hours to rotate once, so Phobos moves much faster than the planet turns. From the Martian surface, this makes the moon appear to rise in the west and set in the east, the opposite of what we are used to seeing with our own moon. It moves so quickly that it can rise and set more than once during a Martian day. Then you look at Phobos itself, and the mystery grows. Its surface is covered with deep craters and long grooves, making it look more like a battered piece of rock than the smooth, round moon most people imagine. Scientists still have different ideas about where it came from. Some believe it may be a captured asteroid, while others think it could have formed from material thrown into orbit after a huge impact on Mars. Those questions have also opened the door to stranger ideas. Some writers have suggested that Phobos could be artificial, especially because of its unusual shape and other features. But that claim has never been backed by solid evidence. What we do know is that Phobos is slowly moving closer to Mars, and far in the future, it could eventually break apart or crash into the planet. And then there is the connection that has made these moons especially interesting to people searching through ancient stories. Long before anyone discovered the actual moons, Greek mythology already had two figures called Phobos and Deimos, traveling with the god of war. Put that beside Mars, having two real moons with those exact names, and it is easy to see why some modern writers began wondering whether the ancient connection meant more than a coincidence. The same idea has been pushed into the Book of Enoch, with some readers asking whether its descriptions of strange heavenly beings and movements could somehow be linked to what we now know about Mars. But this is where the story becomes even more interesting, because the mystery is no longer just about two strange moons. It is about why people keep finding possible connections between an ancient book and a planet whose real history is still being uncovered. And that brings us to another question that may be even more surprising. How did the Book of Enoch survive long enough for us to make these comparisons in the first place? The rediscovery of Enoch and the mystery that remains.
There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once in 7 hours. When people find out about that, they're going to say, who put that there? Who put that there?
After everything we have uncovered, perhaps the most interesting question is not whether the Book of Enoch really describes Mars. It is what happens when an ancient story survives for thousands of years and is suddenly viewed through the eyes of a completely different age. When Enoch was written, its authors were trying to understand a world they could not fully explain. They watched the sun, the moon, and the stars, wondered about what existed beyond the human world, and used the knowledge they had to make sense of those mysteries. To them, the sky was not simply something beautiful to look at. It was a world filled with order, danger, and things humans could barely understand. Thousands of years later, we are still doing the same thing, only our tools have changed. Instead of simply watching the night sky, we can send spacecraft to Mars, photograph its surface, and study its atmosphere, and examine the marks left behind by ancient water and geological activity. With every mission, the planet becomes a little less mysterious, but somehow the questions keep growing. We now know that Mars was not always the cold, dry world we see today. It once appears to have had rivers, lakes, and a much thicker atmosphere. Something changed, and over billions of years, that once wetter world became the planet we see now. That is where the Book of Enoch becomes interesting again. Its strange journeys through the heavens and its descriptions of ruined places can be read in many ways. They may have been religious visions meant to explain judgment, the order of heaven, and the consequences of rebellion. But when modern readers place those ancient images beside what science has uncovered about Mars, some of the comparisons are hard to overlook. A world that once had protection is described as being left exposed, while Mars is a world that lost much of its atmosphere and magnetic protection. A place described as ruined and desolate is compared with a planet whose surface now looks cold, dry, and heavily scarred. Maybe that is simply a coincidence. Or maybe the comparison says something about how easily humans recognize familiar patterns in stories from the distant past. Either way, it gives us a reason to look at Enoch differently. Instead of asking only whether the book predicted Mars, perhaps we should ask what kind of world its writers believed they were describing and why they filled their story with such detailed images of the heavens. Think about how different their world was from ours. If an ancient person saw something unusual in the sky, there was no spacecraft waiting to investigate it, and no camera capable of sending back a close-up image. They had to work with what they could see and what they believed. Today, when scientists find something unusual on Mars, they can send instruments to study it, collect samples, measure the atmosphere, and compare the evidence with everything they already know. The methods are completely different, but the curiosity is almost the same. We are still looking up and asking what happened out there, and Mars gives us plenty to wonder about. Its surface carries giant valleys, ancient river channels, volcanoes, impact craters, and other signs of a planet that once looked very different. Its atmosphere is now extremely thin, its surface is freezing and dry, and its two small moons continue circling above it. Scientists have learned a great deal about this strange world, but they are still piecing together the full story of how Mars changed. The Book of Enoch has its own unfinished story as well. For centuries, it disappeared from most Western Christian traditions, while the Ethiopian Church continued preserving it through generations. Ancient fragments later found at Qumran showed that Enoch was being copied long before the medieval period, giving scholars a much clearer picture of how old the tradition really was. These discoveries helped confirm that its stories were part of a much older tradition than many people once assumed. Today, the book gives us a rare look into the ideas, fears, and beliefs of people who lived thousands of years ago and tried to explain a universe they could not fully see, while leaving behind mysteries that still fascinate readers today. And maybe that is why this mystery refuses to go away. We do not need to prove that Enoch was secretly describing Mars to appreciate the strange connection people see between the two. The ancient writers had their explanations for the mysteries above them, and we have ours. But history has a funny way of reminding us that what seems impossible to understand today can become clearer tomorrow. So when you look up at Mars, perhaps the real question is not whether Enoch already told us exactly what happened there. Maybe the bigger question is what we still have not discovered. Because thousands of years from now, someone may look back at our spacecraft, our photographs, and our scientific records and realize that even with all the tools we have today, there were still pieces of the story we never saw. And that leaves us with this question. Was Enoch describing the destruction of a real world long before modern science could see it? Or are we simply looking at an ancient vision through modern eyes and finding a connection that was never meant to be there? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.